We're very pleased to welcome you to our second keynote and our first keynote of day 2, which is going to be given by Professor Ather Zia. Professor Zia, thank you very, very much for joining us at the ungodly time that we have given you. We are very sorry. So I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then I'm going to let Professor Zia talk, and there will be time for a Q&A at the end. If you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand at the end when I call on you, or you can put your questions in the chat and we can read them out. So whatever you feel comfortable doing. I would also ask that you please keep yourselves muted throughout the keynote so that there's no interruptions and we can finish hopefully on time. So Professor Zia is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. She is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Ather is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which won the 2020 Gloria Anzaldúa Honorable Mention Award, 2021 Public Anthropologist Award, and Advocate of the Year Award 2021. She has been featured in the Feminist 2021, a list of 100 women from the Global South working on critical issues. She is the co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak?, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. She has published a poetry collection, The Frame, and another collection is forthcoming. In 2013, Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder-editor of Kashmiri Lit, and is the co-founder, Kashmir Lit, sorry, and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. And her keynote address today is called Women Writing Kashmir. Thank you again very much, Professor Zia, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me and for doing this. It really looks exciting. When I read Tasavvur Collective, it was like these two things coming together, the East and the West in some ways. And since we are based in the Western world, it's always nice to kind of engage and especially talk about writing. So I do have a paper that I'm going to read. I felt like that might better address the time that we have. So that's what I'm going to do. It is titled Women Writing Kashmir. And the only thing is I kind of want to just make this Zoom window smaller so that I can do my reading, and hopefully I will not bore you. I usually don't read because I feel like I'm not a good reader in that sense, but just because I want to stay on point. And I don't want to digress. And hopefully all the questions that I also have in mind and all the ideas that did not get into the paper might come out in the Q&A. So the paper is titled Women Writing Kashmir, but it's not just about that. It's more than that, as you'll see. Often mistaken in the West for wool or a sweater, Kashmir finds ample mention in the colonial classical literature as the green whale. And these are not the worst examples of how the region is often perceived. What is worse is that the place is connected to terrorism or being a bilateral border dispute, all in quotes, between India and Pakistan. What gets invisibilized in all of this is that Kashmir is older than these two larger countries, and that Kashmir and Kashmiris are the primary stakeholders whose political resistance has been effectively criminalized by India at this moment more so. It is in this backdrop we are talking about women writing Kashmir, specifically the Indian administered Kashmir, which is kind of the formal vocabulary used by the United Nations. It's also called Indian occupied Kashmir, Indian held Kashmir, and it's also officially named as Jammu and Kashmir within the Indian Federation. The questions around women writing Kashmir can be asked in two iterations. How do women write Kashmir, and how do women write in Kashmir? While the first iteration pertains to women writing about the historical, political, and social elements, the other is about a Kashmir that is known as the world's most beautiful open-air prison. It draws attention to how women write or can write in this occupied region. How does one write in a place where words are banned and bodies are killable? What happens to writers in such a place? And this is a question beyond gender. And as I said, these questions are not gendered per se, but they are human questions that encompass all genders. As the Indian military occupation's repression is relentless and ever-growing, writing of any kind, be it journalism, fiction, prose, or poetry, or even a clerical memo for that matter, if it speaks truth to power, is essentially censured, surveilled, and downright dangerous for the people writing. An array of laws has been passed in the past 3 years, and of course, from 1947 onwards, that have put settler colonialism, Indian settler colonialism, on steroids. Strict censorship has been a historical reality in Kashmir, but now it's fully institutionalized and legalized through a new media policy. Journalists, writers, human rights activists are increasingly incarcerated, beaten, humiliated, and harassed. The current government in India, headed by the Bharatiya Janata Party, also called the BJP, which is the political wing of Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the RSS, which is a Hindu right-wing extremist militia, which was founded on the ideals of Hindu supremacy, and it also draws from fascist and Nazi ideology. Yet the BJP is not unique in what it is doing in Kashmir, but other secular, quote-unquote secular parties have been equally repressive in Kashmir from 1947 itself. Common masses, as well as scribes, writers, opinion leaders, are barred from writing freely about the ground realities in Kashmir, especially if it puts the government of India in a negative light. In the context of such silencing, how do we talk about writing, especially gendered writing? Leave alone a word. Last year, a Kashmiri woman was suspended from her job for dropping a single emoji on a post, which the government of India called incitement. In this backdrop, what do Kashmiri women write? And what hopes do they have from their writing? And the most important of all, can they write? Is it safe to write? And also, should they write? How do we envisage women writing? Because, you know, I know we are all gathered to think about writing and women and South Asia, but the most important question that is facing me and people who are thinking about Kashmir is, how do we envisage women writing? How do we put expectations about writing on them as a measure of their emancipation, progress, engagement, and futurity in this moment when none can write in Kashmir, except if it's, you know, something that's just trite and that works for the Indian government. Here, before moving on, I do want to flag not just writing, but also the act of not writing in context of decolonization and cultural citizenship. Whether we may be able to talk about it later on or not, but this is what I wanted to flag, because I think this is also something, as we are talking about writing, we also have to think about the act of not writing. So how do women write occupation in Kashmir, and how do they engage with it? In this context, I'm reminded of the famous quote from Lorelei Decorah Means, an Indigenous American scholar, who states about hierarchy of intersectionality, and I quote, "We are American Indian women in that order. In that order, we are oppressed first and foremost as American Indians, as people colonized by the United States of America, not as women. As Indians, we can never forget, and this is American Indians, our survival, the survival of every one of us, man, woman, and child. As Indians, depend on it. Decolonization is the agenda, the whole agenda, and until it is accomplished, it's the only agenda that counts for American Indians. It will take every one of us, every single one of us, to get the job done. We haven't got the time, energy, or resources for anything else. While our lands are being destroyed, our children are dying of avoidable diseases and malnutrition." It's not far removed from what's happening in Kashmir at this moment. And the dispossession really is very scary. The risk and potential of writing in Kashmir also entails a similar hierarchy of identities, that of being Kashmiri, Muslim women, and in that order. Repression is at an all-time high on the natives in Kashmir based on their Kashmiriness, Muslimness exacerbated by the fact of gender. I also want to reiterate issues of attaining gender justice within the besieged community itself cannot wait. And that is very important to note, and is a simultaneous struggle along with the larger political resistance in Kashmir. Women in Kashmir, like men, despite the risks, have written, and increasingly so, about the occupation. While gendered, no doubt, writing in Kashmir is an act of placemaking for capturing the loss and erasure that Kashmiris face each day. In context of Palestine, the loss of homes, land, and memory at Bad Sayed repurposes the concept of placemaking, which encapsulates the creation of a site of a narrative history to counter the increasing depredations of the occupier's hegemony over knowledge production and the deepening settler colonial policies. Here, rather than focus on a publicly hailed writer, I'm offering an exemplar, in a woman named Habla Begum, who several years back still lived in the outskirts of Srinagar, which is the capital city of Kashmir. She had never attended school and she could not read or write. She was around 60 years of age when I first met her. She did not think of herself as a formal poet. Her son, Rafiq, had been a pharmacist and was one of the Kashmiri men subjected to enforced disappearances by the Indian troops in the 1990s. In that decade, these forced disappearances, were part of a tacitly approved repertoire of punishments used by Indian occupation to suppress the Kashmiri Tehreek, which is the name given by Kashmiris to the resistance movement. Thus far, between 8,000 to 10,000 Kashmiri men, both combatants and non-combatants, have been forcibly disappeared by the Indian government forces. With her son's forced disappearance, Habla had descended into the depths of mourning. When I first met her, uncaring of whether people are around or not, she would sing heartbreaking songs all day and night. All her life, Habla had been sought after for weddings and funerals, where her lyrical skills would heighten the occasion. Since Rafiq had been disappeared, Habla's songs had intensified and become her only solace. I found her often repeating a verse from a longer song that she had written, but not written down, which I reproduce here in translation, just 2 lines, and it kind of connotes what she's thinking and feeling. I bear the pain of my heart that is burnt to cinders. I call you day in and day out. Her grief was humbling. Her verse is more potent, more lyrical in Kashmiri than the translation suggests. Like the kin of the other disappeared people, and I'll talk about them in detail as we move on, Habla and her husband collected office memos, inane flyers, and circulars from the government offices pertaining to the issue of disappearances, which were of little consequence to her case of finding her son. So her laments were very eloquent and gut-wrenching. She would say things like, "My Rafiq is lost, her son. Now this document or these documents are my Rafiq," which in Urdu means friend as well, but it brings no rafaqat, which in Urdu means sakor, but it's also used in Kashmiri. So many Urdu words are in Kashmiri and mean pretty much the same. The pronunciation might differ. She called the paperwork that she was collecting and also her laments and songs that she was singing and stringing together as her Rafiq, which is not only her son's name, but also means a friend, and emphasized that it provided no rafaqat. While her tragedy is immense, her power of expression amplified it. I felt Habla's songs needed to be recorded. To me, it was a treasure that was undiscovered and steadily being lost. And I was kind of losing the whole point of what she was doing. I did not have much to offer by way of finding Rafiq, but I wanted to arrange for some documentation. Habla declined the offer. I persisted in making requests, but she never agreed. She would say, "I lost the most beautiful song of them all, who was written by God himself. I would disappear every word I utter if only he were to appear." As a devotee of written word trained by a neo-colonial world order, I could not come to terms with Habla's disappearing poems. How does one not write or document? And selfishly, thinking about the documentation that I wanted to do, how does one comprehend these losses as well? I asked Habla's family if they captured any of her songs. Her husband remembered the verse she repeated often and nothing more. I made a brief video once before she shut me down completely. After that, she never agreed to be filmed either, and I did not want to convince her otherwise because it kind of looked as it was certainly painful to her. How could we make sense of this river of lament that was disappearing into the ocean of mourning? It was eternal and ephemeral at the same time. As part of the repertoire of mourning, Habla's poetry was an act of placemaking, a site of evidence of her son and of his loss. As an embodied memory, it engaged in an act of transfer because that was the only way it was transferred. While it was so evanescent and temporal, the strength of Habla's poetry was an act that was also truly safe from censure. It stood as a symbol of the politics of mourning, allowing contestation against the crippling nature of power. In these private spaces, Habla's resistance was not just a negation of hegemony of Indian tyranny, but a search for technique, a form of power through daily symbolics of placemaking. It was truly what I refer to elsewhere as affective law in motion, basically. In the ambit of feminist anthropology, I theorize affective law as a tool which yields a nuanced exploration of resistance through women's experiences, even when they continue to be discounted as politically naive, clueless, or ambiguous, and stereotypically passive or agency-less. And this is not just limited to Kashmir only, or Kashmiri occupation by India. Habla's poetry became an act based on a complex subaltern ideology expressed in private transcripts, which are usually hidden from the dominant powers. And that is how women write and not write in Kashmir. As a counter-memory, it might remain invisible to the mainstream and have a precarious subterranean existence unless excavated and preserved through ethnographic vigor. And on the other end of the spectrum of the act of not writing Kashmir by a woman inside Kashmir, because writing inside Kashmir is a totally different thing altogether. I want to situate my own example of writing Kashmir where I engage in nonfiction as well as other creative genres. I want to talk about a few experiences in this journey because I think they're important to kind of counter some of the things that are being talked about in these 2 days in different panels, and also speak to how Kashmiri women write, so to speak. And my example is an optic, just a small optic into how I write about Kashmir. And I feel in some ways it does speak to the larger concerns that we have. So my main research focused from 2008 to 2015 on the enforced disappearances in Kashmir, which were impacted by the Indian Army, the militia, and other local forces. And I mainly focused on Kashmiri women's activism, especially the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, which is dominantly led by women activists. And it was co-founded by a mother turned activist named Parveena Ahangar in 1994. Her 17-year-old son was forcibly disappeared, and then she and other families got together. Initially, they were informally working as to search for their sons and search for their husbands as well. But later on, they kind of congregated with the help of a human rights lawyer named Pervez Imroz, and they formed this group. And it's been one of the most dominant human rights activist groups inside Kashmir. Parveena Ahangar has come to be known as the Iron Lady of Kashmir. She's received a Nobel nomination. She's also received the Rafter Prize. She's received several other prizes. So her work is really seen across the globe. And of course, in this moment, they're not able to protest inside Kashmir. So that's something to be flagged. Otherwise, their protest was one of the dominant things that happened every month. So the book that came out of this research is a nonfiction ethnography, which also includes ethnographic poetry. While women are central, the book deploys the enforced disappearances as a lens in asking that how is it possible that a democracy can commit such abuses, because India is, quote unquote, a democracy. And if it does, is it a democracy at all? So the enforced disappearances here served a purpose. Women's activism did another thing. Like the reason it was so important, it was a concatenation of what this quote unquote democracy was doing. But on the other hand, it allowed answering questions about Kashmiri Muslim women who in the Indian vantage have been for the last 30 years and for also since 1947 onwards, stereotypically seen perpetually dominated, desperate to flee from the social patriarchy and thus to be saved. With its strong focus on Indian occupation, an early reviewer, and this is one of the experiences that I wanted to share, an early reviewer of the manuscript asked me if I was exculpating Kashmiri men of all their wrongdoings. And by wrongdoings, they meant sexism and ills of social patriarchy. It's important to demarcate Kashmiri Muslim social patriarchy from the political, military, industrial, patriarchal complex that is the Indian occupation. While these forces impact women, they are by no means equal aggressors of women. Kashmiri patriarchy itself is a besieged and feminized structure, which has, for lack of a better word, which has also shaped a different different dynamics between the genders in Kashmir. So my research was focused on making the occupation ethnographically explicit and also engaged with understanding the social patriarchy that shapes activism of women, but without falling into the trope where Kashmiri Muslim men are proven as uniquely violent or demonizing them in a stereotypically Islamophobic manner. I explored the performative activism because it is very, it was embodied, it was very performative till the point it functioned, which is, I think, since 2 years they have not been able to hold these protests. In this politics of visibility, the motive of performance or performativity became important as a metaphor through which women's activism unfolds, takes shape, and concretizes socially and politically. At the heart of this performative spectacle of the activists, especially the wives of the disappeared, they're called the half widows. And when I was working with them, most of them were younger than 45. So they were really very viable young women for whom protesting in a public plaza was very charged through sexual notions of how patriarchy thinks about women. I theorized the notion of Asal Zanan. Asal in Kashmiri means good and Zanan means woman. Asal Zanan will find resonance across most global cultures where women as a category are constrained to being modest, obedient, caring, responsible, passive, and often inferior to men. Some versions of being an Asal Zanan even specify a good woman is not even seen. So I was doing all of this in the book while talking about the occupation, but for this early reader, all this labor of understanding the double bind on Kashmiri women or of Kashmiri women did not come across as enough in holding Kashmiri men culpable. Because there is a certain way Muslim women are supposed to write about their patriarchies that fits the Western white imperial feminist trope, and what in this case was now an imperial Indian brown feminist trope. So the dispute in the Indian narrative, the dispute of Kashmir in the Indian narrative, I'm speaking specifically of that, is often decontextualized and presented in an ahistoric manner, within which Kashmiri women are cast as unwary victims of resistance movement, which is undoubtedly, of course, this dominated by men. The Kashmiri society and their resistance is portrayed as uniquely misogynist, orthodox, fundamentalist, Islamist, and these are all within quotes, terrorist and traitorous. In short, all anti-Islam stereotypes which are often associated with Muslim men and make it extremely easy to discredit Kashmiri resistance. A case in the point occurred on August 5th, 2019, when the Indian government militarily removed Kashmir's autonomy or quasi-autonomy. This act was illegal by India's own constitution, accomplished militarily by deceitful means. Indian government gave a host of arguments to justify the removal, which also included gender discrimination against women inside Kashmir. This argument was strawman at best, but remained unchallenged and by and large garnered uncritical support from most of the Indian opinion leaders, I want to say all of them, and masses, most of the masses. There was no doubt that Kashmiri Muslim women must be rescued from the oppression of Kashmiri Muslim men. The hypervisibility of Kashmiri women as powerless victims is not an anomaly, but the oppressed dependent, passive, and without agency stereotype is a persistent trope in the Indian imagination as well as their feminist writing. The specter of gender discrimination in Kashmir was made to appear as a natural outcome of the stereotype of Kashmiri Muslim patriarchy, which in common Indian narrative, as I said, is really seen as uniquely violent. And the women have to be rescued from it. Thus, Kashmir's autonomous status was framed as creating a shield for a virulent patriarchal structure which perpetuated gender injustice, and exemplified and which was exemplified by women who married non-Kashmiris and lost their quote-unquote Kashmiri permanent residency, which was not true, really. So that was a strawman argument. And there were some lacunae in that, and we can discuss that in Q&A. So the Indian state blatantly projected itself as the protector of women's rights in Kashmir, while its record of human rights abuses and sexual violence against them, as well as other genders, is internationally documented and denounced. Here I must mention that playing the savior of Kashmiri women, however, is not unique to BJP only, which is the current government. Other political outfits have also cast Kashmiri women as if they share a belligerent social and political relationship with their men and do not support the resistance of their own accord. Such framing specifically pit Kashmiri women against their men and in turn cast Kashmiri society as uniquely, singularly misogynist, regressive, and violent. Thus, to write as a Kashmiri, thus to write as a woman, a Muslim, and a Kashmiri is also to write against what are cast as feminist rubrics. It is to write with extreme caution against social patriarchy while rallying against the military patriarchal occupation that makes Muslim men easy targets and decimates communities around women, and in this case, Kashmiri women. This was also evident during the 2018 Me Too movement when it was going strong globally and in India as well. In Kashmir, the movement began to unfold. A few high-profile Kashmiri men featured amongst the list of the accused. The apprehension that the Indian discourse would appropriate genuine strategy of Me Too movement and deploy it for continued demonization of Kashmiri men became a real apprehension. Kashmiri scholars, especially a bunch of us from Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, decided to write a statement which was entitled Decolonial Feminist Statement on Me Too in Kashmir, to put things in perspective. The statement was endorsed by transnational networks of Kashmiri feminists, and it was co-signed by a large cross-section of Kashmiri and non-Kashmiri feminists and allies. And I also know that the word feminist in this gathering is also charged with meaning, and we should talk about that as well. The statement cautioned that Indian state and its votaries will seize upon anything to discredit Kashmiri Muslim community and by implication denigrate the movement for self-determination and freedom. It alerted Kashmiri men, women, and other genders from being lured into battling each other. While Me Too of Kashmiri men was being hyped, the widespread sexual violence in Kashmir by the Indian forces was denied en masse, and the human rights atrocities that also implode women's lives by the Indian troops and the government. The statement warned Indians against absorption of these women's complaints into tired Islamophobic and pro-occupation narratives, and urged the supporters of Azadi, which is freedom, to not dismiss women's concerns and consider gender and political justice as parallel struggles. So where do I conclude? I know that we don't have much time. I thought that I would finish in 20 minutes. It's already 31 minutes. So I want to return to the key questions of writing Kashmir. At this moment, can Kashmiris write? Is it safe to write? Should they write? How do we envisage women writing? How do we put expectations about writing on them as a measure of their emancipation, progress, engagement, and futurity? Personally, I am on the west coast. Sorry, I'm in the Western continent. I have the privilege of living outside Kashmir. It's too early. Albeit in what Agha Shahid Ali calls the exilic condition, or being in temperamental exile, which means that one is not exiled formally, but in a psychic and physical exile. So there's a privilege of writing, the privilege of distance. And as Edward Said puts it, different characteristics of exile could never be feeling secure, at ease, and satisfied. While they're all there, I can still write. But what about Kashmiris living in Kashmir? journalists at this moment are finding their work, and this was news several months ago, and it's still happening, especially the ones that they have written exposing Indian government, is disappearing from the internet. Several of my friends wrote to me, do you see my article there? Is it there? Do you find it? Is it on the Wayback Machine? So work is being disappeared, writing is being disappeared. In my personal experience of editing Kashmir Lit, which is what you said in the introduction, it's a journal that's still active, and I founded it in 2008. I get at least 2 requests every month. And earlier, there were many, many requests during the week to take down their writing. Recently, fearing that I might have to take down a lot of writing and I might not have content on the site, I began asking the writers if I could change their name to anonymous. My hope being that at some point we will be able to resurrect the writer to their writing. Many declined, thinking that the government could still trace them. A young scholar was arrested under the charges of terrorism for an article he had published in 2010 talking about an uprising at that moment. And around that time, some key contributors to a volume that I'm co-editing wrote panicked emails about opting out of that edited volume. And this edited volume is based on dreams under occupation. If anything, the papers would centralize dreams, and even those were deemed unsafe because they could not write about them, because government of India, the Indian occupation inside Kashmir, deems all kinds of writing that is critical, that shows dissent and resistance, as incitement to violence and terrorism. In this moment, that is what writing is for Kashmir, gendered or otherwise. It is also a moment to ask ourselves about writing occupations, as well as not writing as an act of placemaking and exploring its decolonial potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Zia, for that really, really incredible talk. I have so many questions. I was making notes while you were writing. As we're waiting, I think, for some questions to come in from the audience and on the chat as well, I just wanted to pick up on some things that you were saying, which I found particularly interesting. And I think the one thing about Kashmir and the occupation of Kashmir and how, this complete shutdown that we've seen happen, which has obviously been going on for ages, but the way that it came into focus, particularly in the last year or so, is when you mentioned 5th August 2019, and you specifically called on these strawman arguments that were taking place and how, gender discrimination was cited as one of the reasons for this shutdown. I found myself thinking a lot about how that argument is also used in an international context previously in history again and again and again, and how we don't seem to learn from these historical events. And I'm thinking here about, I've done research on the war on terror, and I'm specifically thinking about this article called Do Muslim Women Need Saving? And, this idea of rescuing Muslim women. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that, and this, these international solidarities and the way that they impact writing Kashmir, writing about Kashmir, and, for someone like you who is so connected with Kashmir, but as you said, this kind of feeling of exile that exists there. I'm just curious to know what you would say about something like this. Does it, the level of international solidarity with Kashmir, and the parallel comparisons that happen with it. I'm just curious to know what you would say, what you think, and we have questions coming in, so I'll get to those as well.
So there's a couple of things that you asked, so I don't know which one to ask first, or if I understood your question correctly. But thinking about Kashmiri writing in the last 30 years, or even in the last 72 years, Kashmiris, as I keep saying, Kashmiris have written, and Kashmiri women have also written. We usually take writing as a form of, as a standard or a manifestation of emancipation of women, and writing is, most cultures that were not colonized, not necessarily, but most of them were oral cultures. And writing is also, and just privileging writing in many forms is also a very colonial aftermath for all of us. So I'm not saying that Kashmiris did not write. In fact, it has one of the oldest scripts, and Kashmiri women have written. If I was to, my initial talk was to be about the trajectory. So I would have gone back into history and, excavated women who have written. But I thought it was a moot point because we know about all of that and people have written in several iterations. But what we don't know in this current moment is the act of not writing, which needs to be resurrected also as an act of resistance, because people have to survive. So it's not as if people are afraid or just threatened. It's also survival. They have to survival in order to resist at some point. So regarding, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm just pulling at some of the threads that you put forth. And then thinking about solidarity for Kashmir and looking towards Kashmiri writing, I think I really don't see that as just gender. I feel there's a danger when people ask me a question about my research, my previous research, which was on, they would be like, so what it is, how is it like, what is women's activism like? We want to know. And it's almost like the gotcha moment that this is gendered. And I'm like, let's take a pause. This is a gendered movement, but these women are trying to find their disappeared men. So there are men involved here, and the men are forcibly disappeared, killed, detained, thrown into jungles. Combatants, non-combatants, most of the disappeared are non-combatants. So it's not just gendered, it's not women's empowerment happening through this activism. That's not what I'm trying to do here. And that's a constant struggle. And I think for me, writing as a Kashmiri Muslim woman, it has become more of a struggle than less of a struggle. Because it's a question that the more you solve, the more it becomes difficult for people to engage with. And then also the discomfort of why is Kashmiri patriarchy appearing in this manner in this story? Why isn't, because we are, as I said in the paper, Kashmiri Muslim women, and here Kashmiri Muslim women are supposed to write in a certain way where we have to kind of like, especially Muslim women overarchingly, we are supposed to write against patriarchies as if we have to catch them by scruff and say in the exact same idiom that Western feminism wants us to do. And in early, some of the, I want to call it feminist writing because that's what it is. It's written by women. Some of the Indian feminists who have written about Kashmir, there has been that kind of idiom going on as well, which I really see as a brown imperial feminist imposition on Kashmiri women. So that there have been politicians who come into Kashmir and they address women as a separate constituency from their men, saying that women are more peaceful. So that keeps happening. So I think in that, as women writers, as Muslim women writers, as Kashmiri Muslim women writers, there's a double bind of writing. Like, how do you write? You want to rally against the social patriarchy, and you have to make sure that you're saying this is social patriarchy, and it is a compromised structure in this moment. And this is the political, patriarchal, military, industrial complex, which is the Indian occupation. And that's a separate thing altogether. And they do impose on women in a very, when they kind of get together, what you see in Kashmir happening right now, there is a lot of domestic violence happening, and we don't have structures to combat it. We have other ills of social patriarchy that are getting exacerbated, especially even in the case of half widows, who are the women whose husbands have disappeared. They don't know whether they're dead or alive. So the Kashmiri media came up with the term half widow, and that's how they're referred to. In their case, when you look at how they have been treated by the social patriarchy and what the military industrial complex does to them, it's a very sad and tragic situation. And in that moment, we have to rally against the social patriarchy. But then how do you save Kashmiri Muslim men from the predations of the larger occupation, which wants to appropriate everything into saying that these are violent communities, violent Muslim communities that are prone to terrorism, and this is what they do to their women, and this is what they do to India. So yeah, that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but.
No, you absolutely, I think you were right. I was pulling at different threads, and you just, addressed most of the things that I was thinking about really, really eloquently. And you're absolutely right with this idea of the military industrial complex, and this question that keeps coming up about also. I feel like they want you, every time you're asked this question about what women's activism is like in Kashmir, they kind of want you to give a very snappy, 2-line answer, and it's the kind of answer that appeals to, a Western white audience and this understanding of feminism that exists in the West. And we actually had several discussions about this at our last keynote with Professor Tahira Naqvi as well. So I feel like it's a good link here to what was being said. We have questions coming in the chat as well, but I've realized that Zara's raised her hand, so we'll go there first, and then I'll come to everyone in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Zia. It's been quite wonderful to hear all of this and very stimulating. It allows me to place a lot of things that I've been thinking about. I'm curious to think about this idea of which is particularly with what happened and what has happened in the last 2-3 years of this entire kind of this narrative of a certain what I would call a Hindu male supremacist gaze towards Muslim women that's kind of I'm sure always existed, but has become very much mainstream in terms of how discourse is, say, playing out on Twitter or in certain sections of the internet. And I remember that tweet, quite disgusting, went quite viral about how, some Hindu supremacists tweeting about how they can buy land in Kashmir and marry the fair, beautiful women of Kashmir. And I think that, if I'm not wrong, Ananya Jahara Kabir has also made that point about in Territories of Desire as to how the landscape of Kashmir, this area that's so beautiful, kind of also maps on this idea of desiring the women there. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this question as to, particularly with what has happened in Kashmir over the last 3-4 years, how Kashmiri women are being viewed as objects of desire in a very perverse way almost in the and you see that narrative sort of emerging, changing. Yeah, that's basically my question.
When I was growing up in Kashmir before 1989, and I kind of came of age when the resistance was starting, and I had lived, and I'm going to answer this through personal experience because I feel like stories are more important to me as an anthropologist than theories. So I know we have male gaze and tropes and all of that, and it can be like the same across the globe, and we have different kinds of gazes. But just to go back to my own childhood, I used to think like, why don't I know things that happened before 1989? And Bollywood is kind of like my it's a punching bag for me, because most of my childhood memories are connected to Bollywood songs, to movies, and Bollywood was such an important part. Though there were not many cinemas in Kashmir, but Bollywood was part of, because when you are when you are under a system that kind of is completely connecting you to the New Delhi and the ethos of what is now India. And then you have all of this culture coming in through. So Bollywood was part of my childhood. And the reason I invoke Bollywood is because I keep asking myself this question as to how were Bollywood films viewed, especially the ones that were based in Kashmir. So the Indian colonial gaze had already permeated Kashmir in 1947 itself, right from, I forget the name of the movie, but it's called Operation something, and it's based on Operation Storm or something like that. I forget the name. It's too early, so I'm kind of already zoning out. It was actually based on how India kind of added Kashmir to its federation and the role of local Kashmiri people. So that had already been happening right from 1947 itself. Then in the 60s, you see movies like Kashmir Ki Kali, and of course, most of you know about Ananya Jahara Kabir's work and the Territory of Desire, the gaze. So in that, what you really see is Kashmiri women as these objects of desire, and the colonial gaze is, but that's not seen as colonial in that. So for the 60s and 70s, the songs are sung in Kashmir. the hype is around that this was shot in Kashmir. This was where my uncle was when the shooting was happening. So it is in such an ignorant and naive way, all of this is seen and narrativized in common imagination, that it's very heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see how people have narrativized. And that also goes to sort of like, a lot of people like to say that when they look at Kashmiri movement or the resistance, they like to kind of they like to kind of say, okay, it's dead now. There was a little bit happening in the last 30 years. It's gone now. People are silent. People are completely. But what we have to really see is the progression. It's taken India 74 years to silence these people, and they're still not silenced. So resistance was happening in different iterations, which is what we have to understand about Kashmir. But the gaze and the colonial ideal that India is inside Kashmir as of now, as we understand it, it took some time because there's a multi-layeredness to Kashmiri politics. There are client politicians involved who promise Kashmiris a complete autonomy within the Indian Federation. And they say, we're also going to have a plebiscite. So Kashmiris are a duped people in all these phases. So that's how you kind of also see this. And that's where the other thing that's dangerous in this gaze, like the imperial gaze on Kashmiris, whether that be sexual, but also the idea of state feminism. And that kind of makes its entry in 1947 itself, because if you look at, and I really like to bracket them as client politicians because it makes my job easier to say that these are politicians who sided and collaborated with India, but they were literally, even if at that moment they were visionaries, but they were client politicians. So the manifestos and the projects that they had, the kind of laws that they instituted in Kashmir, they're very feminist. It's essentially taken from the Communist Manifesto. So you early on see Kashmiri women within that client politician system being raised as a constituency of state through state feminism. So when people say, oh, from 1947 onwards, Kashmiri women are writing, they are educated now, literacy is at 62%. A lot of people are like, okay, doesn't that mean that India has done a wonderful job inside Kashmir? That women, so that's kind of like the layeredness that we have to understand. So it's not easy when we even talk about, I mean, of course, state feminism, and we categorize it as such, but even the idea of literacy, even the idea of writing, and who were the Kashmiri women writing during those phases, it becomes a question of deep, nuanced answers, so there can be no short answers. So what you saw in 2019 wasn't really new. The tirades against women on social media, they were more explicit. What we see now is more explicit because of social media, because we have access to so many forms of information, and they also have access to repressing Kashmiris in so many ways, not just one. For the last 60 years or more, Article 144 is in existence in Kashmir, which means essentially no three Kashmiris can get together and talk on the roadside. They can be immediately seen as a threat to peace, law and order in Kashmir. So in that scenario, how do we think about autonomy? How do we think about what kind of gaze has been directed towards Kashmiri women? And I don't really, I'm not biting your actual question about the gaze, because I know we talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about objectification, and it's been written about. I think it's the easiest thing for us to understand, because that's what occupations do. It just doesn't happen inside Kashmir. But what we have to understand about Kashmir is the violence that even these words do, because it doesn't enable outsiders who are not introduced to Kashmir through its history. It becomes very hard for them to understand when we say Kashmiri women are literate right now. And many Kashmiri women, the tirade was against Kashmiri women who are working in Delhi, which means these are independent women who are professionals. So they could not go to their offices that day because there were tirades against them on social media, so they felt harassed. But many people ask the question, so that means Kashmiri women are at a point where they're actually in Delhi and working in Delhi. And it was seen as something that was a feather in the cap of Indian government but that's not the case. So there has been state feminism in play, where women actually, a constituency of women actually were kind of peddling the agenda of what India wanted to do inside Kashmir. But thankfully, again, as I say, it wasn't really a successful project. So you can take me as an example. I got the framework, I got the education through that system, but I was able to distill what I had to distill, even if my education system did not talk about resistance, did not talk about Kashmiri history, because Kashmiri history isn't in books. It happens around you. So I again, Zara, I don't know if I kind of completely digress from the question, but I think that this was important to kind of underline, as you already talked about the gaze and talked about what was happening inside India at that time. So it's not really new.
No, that was really helpful and helped contextualize a lot of things. Yeah, go ahead, Fatma, with the question.
No, thank you so much for that question as well. And thank you for your answer. We have questions coming in the chat now. And I feel like the two questions that we've got actually go together in a really interesting way. So Vania asks, thanks a lot for the wonderful talk. I am commissioning and editing a project on women writing Kashmir for Verve magazine, India. I hope I'm saying that right. Considering my positionality, what all do I consider while editing writings by Kashmiri women as a non-Kashmiri, so that I am able to do justice to her voice and narrative and break away from the brown imperialist feminism you speak of, and how to correct the wrongs? And the next question we have is from Nandini Chatterjee, who's at Exeter. Hi, Nandini. So she says, Professor Ather Zia, humbled by your work, could you please say something more about not writing or refusing to write can also be a way to make space? So again, this idea of, what voices to privilege, etc., might be a good way to look at both of them together.
So maybe I would start with Professor Chatterjee's question. Thank you so much for your generous comment. I'm so encouraged by both of Professor Chatterjee and Vanya, if I may. So I think so. For the last 5-6 years, I've been constantly thinking about my work here in US. And again, I go back to my own story because I feel like that's one of the best optics that I can use. I keep telling myself, why did I have to come to West to write this book? So I know it entailed a PhD, but it was a concerted decision that I have to come West and I have to get trained here, maybe to be listened to by people who matter, and also to make the West understand, because that's how we kind of have been trained in what are seen as the post-colonial societies, but which essentially are neo-colonial societies, as India is a neo-colonial power. So in that sense, writing to me was so important from the word get-go. Like when I was young, I kind of I saw this as something that I wanted to do. I was doing it, and it's so privileged. And someone who writes and records, suddenly it becomes a privilege. It becomes something that we go back to. But as an anthropologist, what I saw myself doing, and this is a trope in anthropology, again, I don't want to succumb to tropes, but we anyways do because we are academics. So the idea of witnessing, the idea of, going back to undoing sanctioned ignorance and all of that, I saw my work at doing that. But then when I was with the women, because that's what anthropologists do, they work on ground, they talk to people, they are there, and they are doing, all the colonial things that we've been taught, as anthropology is also the handmaiden of colonialism as it's seen, but we are trying to decolonize it. So all of that went into its making. And then I realized that there was so much that was not being written, and that was more important than what was being written. So I was writing about it, and I was kind of getting pushed to the forefront that I have written about it. But what about the people who are not writing? And that becomes more exacerbated in this moment when people are actually dropping out of writing. So my question to Vanya would be, I would like to answer her question, and I hope I can, but like, who is writing for Verve, and what are they writing about? Because the kind of things that I am writing, and the kind of things that I am co-editing, and in which these people are contributing, are undoing the occupation. They're thinking about the occupation, and they are opting out of it. And many are saying that we will do this after I reach wherever they are, which means outside India. And many are like, okay, I will do this after. And they also know that they probably are not going back to India or Kashmir after their writing. So those are the things that are happening in this moment. And I keep thinking that there are, I'm thinking like, should we be publishing this co-edited volume and have empty pages for all the people who are opting out of writing as a symbolic of what was not published there? Can that be an act of non-writing as an act of placemaking? Because that's kind of like, I'm actively thinking about like, how do we do that? And how do we record what's not being written in this moment, and not written, what's not being put out publicly? So they have written it, but they don't want to put it out. So that's something I'm say something about not writing review. So that's how I kind of think that I can pay homage to people who are not writing, who should be writing more than I am writing. And I have the privilege of doing this, but then I don't have the privilege of going back and being there without risks and dangers to my person or the kind of work that I'm doing. So I don't know if I answered your question again, but I feel like this act of not writing is really on my mind these days. And when someone asks about gendered writing, I feel like, is that even a question in this moment? That is such a imperial feminist trope, like the gendered writing, as if that's, I mean, I see its emancipatory potential. I see where it's coming from, but I don't know if it's serving Kashmir in this moment. So then to go back to, so Vanya has written to me. So I'm just thinking like, you're asking me regarding your positionality. So I'm really encouraged by a lot of Indian allies who are thinking about their positionality. And I think that's the first step where we can undo a lot of things that have happened, especially in thinking about Kashmir, and undoing the kind of violence that has been done, not just the military occupation, but in the Indian imagination against Kashmiri women. So I think that's really helpful, like to start from there. And there are Kashmiri women's writings that are already out published that you might want to go back to and think about those as you are editing and as you're talking to these people. And I would say, I mean, I'm not in a position to say like how to do justice to their voice. I usually, when people talk about like, how do we talk about Kashmir? And I say, listen to Kashmiris. So it seems like you're already listening to Kashmiris and their narratives. I would say, don't change what they're writing and keep it as such. But I would also be, I'm really curious to see what kind of an edition you're putting together, because at this time we're finding incredibly difficult for people to write about Kashmir. I do have a little experience to offer. I wrote an article for Polar, which is a political and legal anthropological journal. I don't remember the full acronym, but it's a very, very well regarded anthropology journal on politics and legal affairs. And so they sent me a lot of edits, and I kind of looked over them and accepted some, rejected some. And then when the paper was published, I didn't know that the copy editor would change places where I had written Indian occupied or something. They wrote Indian Kashmir. And to me, that's a huge difference. I mean, for them, it was like there is a Pakistani Kashmir and then there is an Indian Kashmir. I said that this is completely unacceptable, because the kind of vocabularies we use, we deploy, they mean something to Kashmiris, because there's a certain vantage in how we talk about Kashmir. And in the last 40 years, Kashmiris have increasingly known how to talk about themselves, because earlier on, they did not know how to talk about themselves, because there was such layeredness. Are they fighting the British? Are they fighting the monarch? Now, are they having a plebiscite? So there was, and then there were the client politicians telling them things otherwise, especially that we are having a plebiscite. So the confusion is gone now. There is a very clear narrative. So I would say, pay attention to the way they are writing and the way they are kind of expressing these very important terms. Even if you're doing copy editing and you think this is mere change of grammar and mere making sentences clean and clear because that's what the copy editor told me, I said, no, it's making the sentence clear, but it's making the meaning obscure, and it's a form of violence. So that's what I would say. And then correcting wrongs, I think just being here and just listening is a start. So I don't know how to correct wrongs. I'm committing a lot of wrongs myself. So let's see how that happens. And I feel like solidarity and also thinking as you're editing this and as you're kind of working on this, knowing that human rights violations in Kashmir and ameliorating them is not the end. The end is to understand why human rights abuses are happening, because they're not happening in a vacuum. They're happening as a response to what Kashmiris are demanding. So maybe, keep that in mind.
Thank you so much for that very, very gracious response. And we've hopefully addressed 2 questions in one go, which is great. We still have time before the next panel starts. So I will call on Sheila to ask her last question, and then we can wrap up. So go ahead, Sheila.
Thank you so much, Professor Zia. That was a fascinating talk. And I'm particularly interested in the recent, although this sort of goes back decades, but the sort of recent scholarship on the comparisons between Palestine and Kashmir. And you've written on this yourself. So I want to sort of ask you if you can briefly sort of talk about what you mentioned in your recent article about affective solidarity and the ways in which Kashmiris sort of see the struggle in Palestine, if there is some sort of trans-geographical solidarity there, in what form does it sort of show itself in the region? And also, I guess, because we're talking about Kashmiri women, Muslim women, how does it sort of crop up in women's sort of narratives in Kashmir? What does it look like in terms of the comparison, or maybe if there aren't that many parallels, the dissimilarities in the experiences of Palestinian women as opposed to Kashmiri women? If you could just briefly talk on that.
I think one of the similarities, it has to be understood, and especially because India is increasingly, even with its own Indian Muslim population, as it's kind of explicitly categorizing them as Muslims, it's easy for me to now talk about Kashmiri Muslim women, because early on, most of the training that I had got, and I would ask myself this question, like, how much is this a Muslim problem and how much is this a Kashmiri problem? But with the kind of politics and with the kind of situation in India at this moment, and what is also affecting the entire South Asian subcontinent, I feel like thinking about Kashmir as a Muslim issue, Kashmiri Muslim issue, is not communalizing it as much as it is specifying the diagnosis to the last T, like really, really diagnosing it. So thinking about Palestine in that context, I would say that Palestine and Kashmir are vastly different, because they occupy different locations in history. They have had their own struggles, but there are so many parallels that it's uncanny to think about the two. And as you said, we have thought about it. Professor Goldie Osuri, who is in UK, so you might know her better than me. She and I co-edited a volume where we kind of like put these 2 issues side by side, trying to see what the similarities are and what the differences are. I would say, till very recently, so there are many similarities and dissimilarities, but I would like to talk about one which is very important, which is there are many scholars who would disagree with us that Kashmir is an issue of settler colonialism. They were like, that is Palestine, because that's what the Israeli settler colonialism is doing. They're occupying the territories. That's not what's happening in Kashmir, because Kashmir is quote unquote a majority Muslim state, and that's how it is, and it has the autonomy, and there is no flux, and there is no also quote unquote exodus of Muslim populations. And the only migration / exodus, whatever we want to call it, is of Kashmiri Pandits. And so that was like a major disagreement there. And now, after 2019, this becomes very visible that it's a settler colonial problem. And what we have been trying to establish in the last 15 years, that there have been many Kashmiri Muslim migrations that have happened. Not only during 60s, 70s, 80s, when actively the armed uprising had happened, but also in 1947, which was narrativized by even Mahatma Gandhi as that there is communal harmony inside Kashmir, and I do not see any communal problems or conflagrations. But we could easily forget the massacre in Jammu of Kashmiri Muslims. And that is not to say that there was not a massacre of Sikhs and Hindus in that time period in the region, but massive pogroms against, and orchestrated and institutionalized pogroms against Muslims when the Muslims left 8th November after 27th October 1947, when Indian military officially lands. It's already there as a different contingent, but it officially lands inside Kashmir and occupies it. So we completely forget the migration of the Jammu Muslims / the pogrom of Jammu Muslims, which actually made Jammu a Hindu-dominated place. It was 68% Muslims before. So that kind of, what we see the different phases in which the Kashmiri Muslims have also left the region. We kind of see that it's not new, these kind of migrations, but they are so invisibilized in the narrative that, and it's not just invisibilized in a moment, that it also does a disservice, because if you don't talk about it, India appears as it doesn't appear as the belligerent force that people remember it as, but the way it's narrativized that it went in and it saved the Kashmiri people because there was a raid. That's how it's seen, as the Kabaili raid from Pakistan, which is completely in which the role of Western Kashmiri Punchis who were fighters in World War II, that's completely invisibilized. Like, those people were the revolutionaries who were fighting their ruler. So, in that moment, I feel like that's something that we need to consider when we are thinking about Kashmir. As you said earlier, that answering stuff about Kashmir is so hard, because you have to go back into history. So much has been snowed under, so much has been pushed under the carpet, that the easiest for everyone is to begin from 1947 and say that Kashmir is a 1947 problem. It's a post-colonial aftermath, completely forgetting that it's not just a post-colonial aftermath. There is no post-colonial in the South Asian continent. Everything is neo-colonial. So I don't know how far I got with the answer, but that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. That was illuminating, especially what you ended with, there's no post-colonial, there's just the neo-colonial. And I think that's that's sort of the blurb that we're going to take away from this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. That was incredible. We are out of time now. We've actually taken 10 minutes more of your time, Professor Zia. So thank you for being so generous with questions. And I really like the fact that, we're ending on this note, because we have a bunch of panels today where we're talking about citizenship, protest, resistance, dissent. So, it's a good way to begin the day, but to end this talk, and especially the line that you said about, it took India 74 years to do this, because Kashmiris, despite the fact that, as you said, they've been resisting since day one. And that's not something that's going to change, whichever form that resistance may take place in. So I think that's a really nice note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. We know it is ridiculously early for you, and we're very, very sorry and very, very grateful that you joined us. This was an incredible talk, and we're really, really glad we had a chance to listen to you speak. So thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you. I leave you to. I'm trying to see how I can fit the panels in my schedule as well. So I'll try to be there. Thank you so much.
Please do. Everyone can just kind of come and go as they please. We let everyone in from the waiting room. Just again, so the next panel for us is panel, give me a second, panel 3A, digital media representation in this room. And if you would like to attend panel 3B, which is parallel, which is the first part of citizenship, resistance, and protest, that is in room B. There are 2 Zoom links that were sent to everyone, but we will have someone put in the link for panel B in the chat now. And you're welcome to stay in this room, and we'll start in about 5 minutes. Otherwise, join us in room B and we'll start there. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Professor Zia, and we will see you all soon.
All the best.
Again, if you would like to attend 3A, just stay on this link. And if you want to attend 3B, please hop onto the other link. So just because someone is asking, we have Fatima Khan today, Elisabetta Campagni, Stuti Pachisia, and Zoya Rahman for this link, this panel. The other link has Professor Zoya Hassan, Dr. Safa P, Mridula Sharma, Karthik